the shape of our world? How do our ideas about the world condition our reading of the past? In this module, I want to talk to you about bias and the nature of historical comprehension. Now, most of us think that the past is dead in the sense that the events that happened in history are hard set and cannot be changed. And of course, that is certainly true in a certain sense. But when we open a book and read the pages of history, we imbue them with life. And what I mean by that is invariably we impose upon the words on the page our own inherent cultural map. A context, certain informal beliefs about Canada, presidents, GDP, how society works, what is fair, and, basically how humans behave. To show you how this might be true, I've attached to the famous Salter map. Now, most students, when they look at this, they don't recognize a map, at least not immediately. And for sure, it's not like most modern maps that students are accustomed to reading. It's not built or designed for terrestrial navigation, for example. But if you inspect it a little bit closer, what you see is that dot at the center of the world is Jerusalem. The red line is the Red Sea. At the top of the world is Jesus Christ, whose spirit is animating the world and connecting all these biblical stories like the Garden of Eden with places that exist in the material realm of existence. So what we have here is not a roadmap, but essentially a map for salvation. Because for medieval Christians who understood that God's love permeated the material world, this provided a guide of how to get through the gates of heaven. So the fundamental point is whether you're reading a map or reading a history book, we all have these mental maps that we impose upon the text. And they really facilitate our ability to read the pages of history by filling in the picture and projecting out our assumptions, providing the scene a context. And our ideas about normalcy enable us to interpret what happened. Now, many of these ideas that we project onto the pages of history, whether World War II was a catastrophe, that Churchill was brave or wise, if good triumphed over evil, these are not necessarily facts that are objectively true. They are beliefs, myths, assumptions that we carry back onto the past. Now, when it comes to Canadians' understanding of the world, we know that on average our geographical literacy is not very high. It's not just that, some of us struggle to locate Guinea on the map of Africa. It's that, many of our basic perceptions or presumptions about the world are relatively warped. One example is just the way that we tend to underestimate the sheer scale of the Pacific. And the reason for that is because most of us, when we picture our world, we think about this Mercator projection wall map that slices up the world and pushes the Pacific to the fringes or the edge of the map. But what's misleading about that is that the Pacific is 165 million square kilometers. So we could actually gather every single continent and island on Earth. We could sink them all into the Pacific Ocean and still have room left over to plant another South Africa. So how about the Al-Idrisi map? When most people see it at first, they're like, what the heck is that? Then they calibrate and they say, hey, this is upside down. But is it really upside down? Why is the top of our maps always denoted as north? Is there a up or down in space? Or are north and south cultural concepts? Did you know that early Egyptian and Islamic maps often placed the south at the top? Christian TNO maps placed essentially east at the top. North became the standard primarily because of the magnetic compass and because Western empires sailed the oceans blue and conquered the rest of the world and established their convention as the global standard. Now, we all remember back to, like fourth or third grade social studies when we learned about maps and the difference between a globe and a map. And of course, the most typical wall map in Canadian schools is the Mercator projection. And since, the world is a sphere and you have to flatten it, it means that to depict it on a two-dimensional surface, there has to be distortions. And one of the distortions that is, kind of well known, it's kind of illustrated here, is that the Mercator map in particular tends to shrink the size of Africa or expand the relative size of Europe. Did you know that the Organization of African States has objected to the Mercator projection, arguing that it perpetuates racist thinking by shrinking the size of the global south in general, and Africa in particular, of course, relative to the more developed, richer north? Africa is a massive continent that anyone that flies from Paris to Johannesburg knows it takes a lot longer than to go across the Atlantic to New York. Africa is so large that you can squish, United States, China, India, Eastern Europe, and quite a few Western countries inside it, and still have room to spare. So why, in the cultural maps of so many Canadians, is Africa so small and therefore insignificant? Now, many of us think that geopolitical maps are essentially objective renderings of geographical facts. In other words, referencing physical geography, rather than being cultural texts that present a slanted view of the world and its structure. So by far the most common maps that are both on news programs and in our schoolrooms where we're learning about our world are geopolitical maps. And what do geopolitical maps do? Well, they don't record most often geography, mountain ranges. Essentially what they do is they color in the map according to political states. So various states are given priority and given a cultural code so that we can designate them. So what it's basically saying is that states are history's actors, so that when we're looking at the past, they are the units that are important, the basis of political human organization. Now, the basic argument of geopolitical maps, or what they try to present as normal, is that humanity is somehow a family that's complexly bifurcated according to people's nationality. And that's not to say that being a Canadian or Chinese or Indonesian isn't important, but that's only one way of looking at humanity and its relationship to the earth. In the 1962, when John Glenn left the cradle of the earth and rocketed up and ascended into heaven and looked down, he was surprised. As he's staring through this lonely porthole, what does he see but this beautiful, relatively small blue ball? an island or oasis of life set against the cold silence of outer space. And what strikes him, being kind of one of the very few humans to look at the Earth at the whole, is that the geopolitical map that he had been indoctrinated to see as normal was really not telling the fundamental truth. That despite our differences, ethnic, gender, religious, whatever, we were all humans and co-inhabitants of a cosmic Eden. And some people have, in a way, credited the rise of the environmental movement with this ability to visualize all living things together onside the planet. Now, many Canadians like to believe that we're very liberal, not liberal in the political sense, but liberal in the sense of being, free thinkers, that we have a multicultural natural identity, which is, relatively rare within the world. So as a result of that, we have somehow liberated ourselves from bias and recognize the mutual validity of different cultural values. But is that true, or is that just a type of myth and tale that we tell ourselves? Are our ideas about time and space actually deeply colored by centuries of Western thinking and fundamentally Eurocentric, in the sense that our assumptions about the world are heavily focused on Western Europe and the Western cultural experience? Now, in our heads, we carry lots of ideas like Middle East or Far East, and they are telling us something about geography. The Far East is essentially a colonial term. The Europeans were, during the age of navigation, trying to get to the Pacific to get access to critical spices, and later Chinese goods, which were luxuries like silk and various forms of ceramics. The Middle East was in between. So these ideas about areas of our world go back to a colonial time, and also the story of the prime meridian. How is it that the prime meridian goes through London, England, or more specifically Greenwich, England? So if you go to Greenwich, you can see, this little bar here that's gold in places. And you can jump from one side to the other, so you're going from east to west. But how did that get determined that that was the center of the world? Essentially, because the West was powerful, they established that as the basic calibration point. They put Europe at the center, and the non-Western world was put at the periphery. Well, the Japanese, who had many bones to pick of Western imperialism, didn't really like that. So during their empire, one of the things that their cartographers did is they decided that they would put the prime meridian through Tokyo, and that Tokyo would be the center of the world. And of course, you can perfectly make a map that makes sense there. You can focus it on the Pacific, as the Japanese empire was focused on consolidating the Pacific. These are not natural lines. These are cultural constructs, grids that we overlay in our reality so that we can make sense of our world and distinguish the various quarters of it. Now, one of the claims of geopolitical maps is that the state is the basis of our contemporary geopolitical system, so that you'd want to designate that on our maps, which are in a sense metaphors for our world. But anyone that has traveled, for example, to Europe knows that although Europe might be a continent, that Eastern and Western Europe feel different. And even if you're inside a state like France, France is very different. Brittany, Alsace, the Dordogne, Provence, these are all very different regions. Various nomadic groups don't even recognize these state boundaries as they follow time immemorial routes, moving across them, looking for water and resources for their livestock. So our mental maps, in essence, very heavily layer our reading of the past. It feels like a map is static and it's recording some kind of information rooted in somehow the geophysics of the Earth's mantle. But history has left a heavy footprint on the structure of human civilization. What we consider the Middle East today, it's a relic of a distant historical event. Muhammad and the Arab conquest that established Islam over this geographic region that stretches across North Africa all the way into the Sahel. So, the shape of our current world has been very powerfully conditioned about events in the past about which, probably most Canadians are only peripherally aware. And another thing that maps obscure are the tremendous differences between urban and rural communities. In many senses, the difference between a Parisian and someone living in rural Champagne is greater than the difference between a Parisian and a Londoner or Manhattanite. In many areas of the world, rural patterns of life are still rooted towards the rhythms of nature rather than the 24-hour production schedule. And our world is very uneven. I mean, Canada is a great example of that. 66% of our population lives within 100 kilometers of the United States border. Notice it's on the south. Most of Canada is uninhabited wilderness. Nunavut, which is a territory, only has 45,000 inhabitants. That's about the equivalent of Chelsea and Wakefield together, if you put in a few more towns with it as well. On the other end of the periphery, you have these massive megalopolises, where you can basically drive in the Pearl River Delta or the Northeast Corridor from, Washington to Boston, and, basically never leave the city. And these are the areas of tremendous economic power connected to the global economy. And quite frankly, many of the states that you find on a geopolitical map are not nations. So when you're going to areas of Africa, what you find is that the boundaries are very arbitrarily established by colonial power, and that they don't really capture the tremendous multicultural diversity and even groups that have transnational identities that transgress the boundaries that were imposed on the African map during the 1885 Berlin Conference. Political boundaries are also overlaid of natural, ecological boundaries. So obviously, Israel has been a lot in the Canadian news and consciousness ever since the first Arab-Israeli War in 1948. But one of the things that's being contested is not only the creation of a Jewish state, but the control of water. you could, I'm not saying it's a legitimate enterprise, but you could explain most of the conflicts in this region with at least an angle in terms of establishing control over the Jordan watershed, the water resources, which is the critical ingredient to life and the future of the states. Now, many Canadians look at the world from a sense relict assumptions inherited from the 20th century that Canada is, in a sense, secure because of these vast oceans that prevent us from harm and danger. During World War II, the war didn't really touch our shores. And because the Arctic is so inhospitable and the United States is such a reliable ally and powerful military power, we don't have to worry about our defense. But what's, of course, been happening is that the world itself has been shrinking tremendously. Starting with the Victorian internet to telegraph, and then continuing on with telephones and satellite television, and then the internet, is that states no longer exist in a vacuum, and the relative distance between two places has shrunk appreciably. To a significant extent, we don't live in Lester Pearson's Canada anymore, in the sense that these new technologies, internet, video conferencing, cell phones, have so reduced the relative distance not only between places, but broken down the barriers that once separated economies, that now when a country like Thailand has a currency crisis, our stock market can feel it within a matter of hours. When Iran attacks Israel, it can lead to the closing of the Straits of Hormuz and the cost for bread in our stores going up by 100% in a matters of weeks. So in this new borderless world, Canada no longer has the luxury of imagining that it can set a wall or a perimeter around the territory of the state and be insulating from historical events transpiring all around, because our economy, our society is fundamentally interconnected to what happens beyond our shores. Now, if we take the example of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, what an important discourse. This is this dream, and then, slavery is at an end. But what was the era in 1863? When he gave this address, he didn't even have a microphone to modify his voice. There was no internet to project it out. So, in essence, he gave these words to about 100 people who, at the very end of the crowd, probably had a hard time hearing his voice. Now, given the importance of what he said and how they were recorded on newspapers and how it impacted the Civil War and changed the fundamental rights of African Americans, these words had tremendous power. But consider how the world had changed essentially 140 years later. So by the 21st century, as the internet and cell phones had proliferated, basically computers became normalized in average Canadian households, the FIFA tournament in South Africa, 2008, for the first time in history, this is an important threshold, essentially half of humanity tunes in to watch the beautiful game, to root for their team on a national stage. So this shows the transformation to a borderless world, how these various digital technologies are bringing us together in ways that are unprecedented, so that it's not just that events far away from us geographically can have a big impact, but a lot of the events that happen are no longer happening on the geographical realm. They might be happening in the virtual world. Currency, Bitcoin, all of these instruments are now driving events in the real world. To consider how geography has changed, we can look at how the goods inside our classrooms, inside our houses, have been made. It's been constructed by the post-Fordist production model, which means that essentially the basic components that make up a lamp, a computer, or a car were subcontracted out to private suppliers that might be in different countries. So if you have a Honda Civic, which has 6,000 parts, the raw materials, the components might be in 90 different countries, and they're flowing across rail lines and container ships to assembly plants where they're fabricated into their final consumer form. The Honda Civic that's then shipped to distributing networks, car dealerships, for sale around the world. So, in essence, in this tightly economically integrated world created by neoliberal globalization, it is no longer states that are significant. It is these supply chains that are dictating how things are made, sold, and packaged. And as many countries like Canada are discovering, to be really secure, to ensure that you can feed your population, build bridges, means having secure suppliers and not economic partners that use the supply chain as leverage to get an economic benefit over you. So the way that we once looked at the world with essentially states as independent units, perhaps states as coalitions and organizations like NATO, using ships to protect the sea lanes. These are all ideas about territory, space, and organization that are rooted in the 20th century. And we need to start to think about the world in terms of its new physics. Not only the integration of economies across territorial boundaries, but the various ways that technologies are creating new structures of intersection that have very little resemblance to traditional doctrines of national defense. If we need to protect Canada, it means not only to protect our north from Chinese trawlers or Russian mineral companies, it also means protecting our food supply from sabotage, or our hydroelectric dams from cyber warfare. So in some sense, the geopolitical maps that we are taught since a young age as children, and we're taught to identify the states, and that this is somehow important, that these are illustrations of a world. What do they reveal and what do they obscure? Which map is more accurate, the one on the left or the right? You could definitely make a case for the map on the right, which just gives graphical illustration how the world economy is really heavily concentrated in a handful of states, with the United States and China as the two powerful pivots that dictate almost half of the economic productivity in the world, and where essentially 80% of the world's population, most non-Western cultures, have very little economic footprint or influence in the basic decisions that drive production or the way that the world is governed. Now, many Canadians would like to believe that we believe in the rules-based order, the international system, human rights, that the United Nations stands and protects people from abuse and genocide. But to what extent are these institutions and values driving the pages of history? And to what extent do the selfish, self-interested motives of powerful people like Elon Musk driving current events? If we look at a geopolitical map, we would imagine that states are supreme, that they are history's actors, and that by appointing our political leaders, we, the people, can exercise some control over our world. But to what extent are these beliefs true or comforting myths, lies we tell ourselves to provide the illusion of some sort of control? What we see around the world is that our world is very unequal. Now, Canada is on the global spectrum of things more equal than most states, not as equal as Scandinavian states with their redistribution payments and social safety net. But most of the world, particularly the so-called third or non-Western world, there's extreme inequality as residents connected to global capitalism and multinational firms run off with a lot of the money, whereas most people don't have a voice inside their government. And lacking a voice, they don't have a lot of control over their lives or the use of the resources inside their state boundary. So this very map illustrates the idea that the way that power works in our world is not really predicated on the idea of an international system of sovereign equality states. Powerful people own many resources and bend the system to benefit their interests. And world wraps are really a relic because we're spending more and more of our time in digital spaces. So that when we go online, we enter environments that are completely outside of the traditional geopolitical thinking that we used to use to consider our world. And these communities don't reflect the cultural and linguistic diversity on Earth. Essentially, when we look at things like STEAM, what we see, or the internet, is that English is the predominant language. So in that sense, geopolitical maps don't really tell us the story of how power is held and used, because on these geopolitical maps you don't find any reference to Zuckerberg, Musk, or Jeff Bezos, and probably they should. Because after 2003 there was this amazing shift in the geopolitical system, in the sense that the 50 largest economies in the world were no longer states, but multinational corporations. Now, many of these corporations, many of them are American, many of them are digital giants. What we see is that their market cap is larger than the GDP of many states. And this shows a real changing of the guard. That with neoliberal globalization, multinational corporations were able to colonize the economy, establish footholds across various national economies, almost completely escape taxation, transforming themselves into transnational corporations that have tremendous economic power. So someone like Jeff Bezos can hold a province like Quebec hostage. If they want to try to establish a labor union, he can simply pull his warehouses out of Quebec. He can create a bidding process between the United States and Italy for setting up his corporate headquarters and moving money there. The problem with multinational corporations is that obviously they don't answer to the interest of the public good. By definition, by law, their sole fiduciary responsibility is to return money to shareholders. In other words, they are legal sociopaths who value making profit over any environmental value or social good. So, in taking you on this journey in terms of the shape of our world and looking at various maps and geography in different scales, one of my central points is that most of us, when we look at the past, bring to this reading well developed concepts about our world, its contours, and how it works. And if history is a discipline where the Holy Grail is objective truth, then the only way that we can look at the past objectively is to be critically self-aware of the filters that we're applying upon the past. So, one of the primordial sins of Canadians when it comes to reading history is our blatant, often unaware Eurocentrism. We're just naturally more aware of European landmarks like the Eiffel Tower. Our nightly news really just talks about white politicians and European affairs and only ventures into talking about Africa if there's some Canadian mining company or something that's involved. And when it comes to history, we have normalized these ideas that what history is the story of these powerful white statesmen, European states, our European ancestors. So one of the ways that we can strive to be more objective is essentially to turn our world upside down. And, what if instead of, thinking about all these myths that we learned in primary and secondary school, we would just tell the story of women, ethnic minorities, and the global poor. How would that history that we would learn this semester be different from the traditional tale? So I guess if we would tip our world upside down and try to create a non-Eurocentric history, it would obviously be a history that would really have very little to say about Canada. It's essentially a very peripheral state, very few citizens. It's not very economically significant. So all of these things that we were taught, Lester Pearson, contributing to the UN, that would just not be covered. So if you would get one of your old textbooks from high school, essentially what we need to do is tear out most of those pages. We'd only be left with like the kind of text boxes where they would talk about, some African person for a half an hour and they couldn't put it in the actual page because it's so disjointed from the narrative. They had to make it as kind of a sideshow. This history would, essentially be told from the perspective not of white people, but the people that were conquered or subordinated to rich people or the colonial powers. It would be a history that would rather be focusing on ambitious men like Saddam Hussein, Putin, Trump, who were pursuing power. It would instead be, focusing on things like the amazing resilience of mothers who in places like Afghanistan provided for their family under these impossible situations. So in concluding this module, essentially what I'm asking students to do is to challenge the idea that we are objective. And that, most students think they've got this well-developed bullshit meter, and that as a result of that, they can recognize bias in others, but of course they're not subject to that. They can cut through the fog of disinformation. But where do you actually get your data? And who owns those media sources? And why was this information created? How did it get into your feed? What did it crowd out? And what were the companies that got that data to you? What is their business and geopolitical interest? What I would suggest to students is that the only path to an objective history is to be highly self-critical, not only about what we read, but also, importantly, about our mental maps, our ideas about the world, how it is structured, who are history's actors. And unless we challenge those conceptions, we'll never break free from Eurocentrism.